entering a realm between the hidden and forgotten, a slipstream caught between realities, a secret museum of the esoteric, the private library of shadows, all taking place in a world forged from mystery and caught between logic and myth. You are entering ParaReality.
Good evening, seekers of the strange and the unexplained, and welcome to ParaReality, a place where the line between fact and mystery begins to blur and where the unknown is never as distant as it seems. I'm Sandman, and tonight we're stepping into a question that goes far beyond lights in the sky or fleeting encounters with something we don't understand. For decades, people around the world have reported seeing objects in our skies that defy explanation. Some appear for only a minute, moving with impossible speed before vanishing without a trace. Others linger, silent and massive, hovering low enough to be seen clearly, yet offering no clue as to what they are or how they operate. And then there are those that seem almost out of place entirely. Long, distant shapes that suggest a larger something operating on a scale that we rarely glimpse. Now, at first glance, these sightings may seem disconnected, random, isolated, easy to dismiss as misidentifications, natural phenomena, or just the product of an overactive imagination. But when you begin to look closer, when you examine the details, the patterns, the consistency across time and across witnesses, something else begins to emerge. These objects aren't all the same. They fall into distinct categories. You got disc-shaped craft, often referred to as flying saucers. You have massive triangular objects that are silent and imposing. And then you have elongated cigar shapes that just form and appear, but these do this far less frequently, but they carry with them an entirely different set of implications. So we have three shapes, three patterns, three behaviors, and perhaps something more. Because what's truly unsettling isn't just that these objects look different, it's that they all behave differently, almost as if they serve different roles, almost as if they're not random at all, but part of something structured, something coordinated, something operating with a purpose we have yet to fully understand. So tonight, we're going to explore that possibility. We're going to look beyond individual sightings and begin connecting the dots between them. We'll examine some real cases, real witnesses, and real moments where something entered our skies and behaved in ways that challenge everything we think we know about flight, technology, and perhaps even our place in the world. Because the question isn't simply, what are we seeing? The question has become, what if these objects are connected? What if they're part of a system? And if that's true, then what we've been witnessing all this time may not be random encounters with the unknown, but something far more deliberate, something organized. And if it's organized, then someone or something is behind it. Welcome, my friends, to ParaReality. To learn more, of course, as always, you'll have to tune in, and find out. But before we dive into tonight's episode, I want to take a quick minute to make an announcement. Excuse me. I want to let you know where you can find me out in the real world over the next few months, basically over the course of the summer. So if you're anywhere near Tennessee or Kentucky, in May, June, July, August, I'll be appearing live at several events over the course of the summer. Beginning on May 2nd, I'll be at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Festival in Townsend, Tennessee. And then on July 25th, you can catch me at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference, which is separate than the festival. I'll be at the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, which is right down the road from Townsend. And in August, I'll be heading on over to Hopkinsville, Kentucky for Goblin Con, and that'll be on August 22nd and 23rd. That's a 2-day long event. So once again, if you're anywhere around Tennessee and Kentucky and you're a fan of the podcast, or you like this kind of thing and you just happen to randomly find this podcast and be listening to it, I want to recommend that you go to these 3 events, not just because I'm going to be there, but because these 3 events are amazing events. First thing, once again, May 2nd, Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Festival in Townsend, Tennessee. Then July 25th, the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And then in August, I'll be in Hopkinsville, Kentucky for the 2026 Goblin Con. That's a 2-day long event on August the 22nd and 23rd. So if you're going to be at either one of these conferences and you've had a paranormal experience, whether it's UFOs, cryptids, hauntings, ghosts, anything unexplained or unusual, and you want to share your experience, I'd love to meet you. I'd love for you to come find my tent or my booth and tell me your story, get it on the podcast. That's why I go to these events. I go to meet you so you can tell me your story and get it on the podcast. I love to hear stories of everyday, ordinary people who've had something weird happen to them that they can't explain. And I want to meet you. I want to hear your story, and I want to get it on my podcast. So once again, May 2nd, Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Festival in Townsend, Tennessee. July 25th, Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. And August the 22nd and 23rd, Hopkinsville, Kentucky for the 2026 Goblin Con. And oh, by the way, I did a thing, and I want to tell you about it too. This will also be available at all 3 events, but last year I wrote a book, and I just sat on it and didn't really do anything with it. And then after the first of the year, I kind of got inspired to let's get this thing published. So I'm very, very pleased to announce that I am now a published author. I wrote a book called Palo Santo and Sage, Sacred Smoke and Spiritual Cleansing for the Beginner. And it is available on Amazon. I'm going to have the Amazon link right here below the screen on the video. Now, if you're not watching the video, if you're doing the audio portion only of this, you can find it on Amazon.com. Just look for Palo Santo and Sage book or Sacred Smoke book, or just type in the whole title, Palo Santo and Sage, Sacred Smoke and Spiritual Cleansing for the Beginner. You can also find it on my website at ParaReality.com. This is a short book. It's about 150 pages, and you do not have to read it from cover to cover to get anything out of it. It's full of rituals and practices, and with sage and Palo Santo. You can use them separately. You can use them together. And if you want to know more about it, it's exactly what it is. It's a guide for the beginner. I've been working with Palo Santo and sage. I don't know, several years. I've been basically since I've been with my wife. She's Native American, and she got me into saging and Palo Santo, and yeah. So I'm really really proud of this book, and I'm really looking forward to you guys taking a read on it and let me know what you think. It's available on Amazon.com and my website, ParaReality.com. So check it out. Thanks. I appreciate it. Well, that's enough about that. Before we actually get into the podcast, I really need to do that pesky commercial break. So take a minute, and I will be right back, and we'll get on with the hidden order of UFO encounters right after this. ParaReality is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. For more information or to check out other shows on the network, please visit evergreenpodcast.com.
Broadcast from a secret bunker somewhere outside of Nashville, Tennessee. This is the award-winning podcast, ParaReality.
Good evening and welcome back, everybody. Before we get any further tonight, I want to take a moment and think back to the very first time you ever heard about a UFO. Maybe it was in a movie, or maybe it was a documentary, or maybe it was a story someone told you when you were younger, something that stuck with you longer than you expected. So chances are the image that came to mind was a flying saucer, a smooth disc-shaped object hovering silently in the sky, glowing faintly against the darkness. That image is so deeply embedded in our culture that it almost feels automatic. It's become the default symbol of ufology. But when you begin to dig into the actual reports, the real eyewitness accounts, the radar confirmations, military encounters, you start to notice something that doesn't quite fit that simple picture. Not everything people are seeing looks like a saucer. In fact, over the past 75 years, reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, what we are now referring to as UAP, have consistently fallen into a small number of distinct categories. Not dozens, not hundreds, just a few specific shapes that appear again and again. And tonight we're focusing on three of the most prominent: the disc, the triangle, and the cigar. Now, at first glance, it might not seem especially significant. After all, perception can be unreliable, and lights in the sky can distort shape and distance. People can misinterpret what they see, but the deeper you go into the data, the harder it becomes to dismiss what's happening as simple misidentification, because these shapes don't just repeat visually, they repeat behaviorally. They don't just look the same, they act the same. Across the decades, across continents, across witnesses who've never met and have no connection to one another. Many of these individuals report their experiences reluctantly, sometimes years after the fact, and often under intense scrutiny. To understand how this pattern begins, we have to go all the way back to 1947, when modern UFO history truly entered the public consciousness. A private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying near Mount Rainier when he observed 9 objects moving in formation at speeds he estimated to be far beyond anything known at the time. Now, you know the story, right? You know this. But what stood out to him wasn't just their speed, but it was the way that they moved. He described their motion as being similar to a saucer skipping across the water. Now, interestingly, Arnold never actually claimed the objects themselves were saucer-shaped. That interpretation came from the media, which simplified his description and introduced us to the phrase flying saucer. From that point forward, the image took hold, and it's remained with us ever since. But even in those earliest reports, there were inconsistencies. Some witnesses described discs, while others reported crescent shapes, spheres, or elongated objects. Now, the phenomenon was never truly uniform, and yet the decades passed. Certain shapes began to dominate the reports, almost as if the noise was gradually filtering out, leaving behind a clearer pattern. This is where our perspective needs to take a shift. If these sightings were entirely random, if they were purely the result of misidentification, psychological projection, or atmospheric anomalies, you'd expect a wide range of forms with no consistency at all. You'd expect chaos. But that's not what we see. What we see is repetition. The same shapes, the same movements, the same behaviors described in remarkably similar ways by people separated by time, geography, and circumstance. And that raises a question that's rarely asked as far as I'm concerned. And that's this. What if this consistency isn't accidental? What if it's intentional? So let's consider that for a minute. Imagine that you're observing a system you don't understand. You don't know who created it or how it operates, but you can see it functioning. And over time, you begin to notice that certain components appear repeatedly, different forms, performing different functions, but clearly part of a larger whole. You wouldn't assume randomness here. You'd assume design. You'd assume purpose. You would assume organization. And yet when it comes to UFOs, we've been conditioned to do the opposite. We isolate each sighting. We analyze it individually, and we explain it away individually. But what happens when you stop looking at these encounters as isolated events and start viewing them as connected data points? That's when the picture begins to change, because suddenly the differences between these objects don't weaken the phenomena, they strengthen it. They suggest specialization, they suggest roles, they suggest structure. Consider the three types we're focusing on tonight. The saucer is typically small, fast, and highly maneuverable, often seen darting through the sky or accelerating in ways that defy conventional physics. By contrast, the triangle is massive, silent, and slow-moving. Often it's seen hovering at low altitudes and sometimes described as blocking out the stars entirely. And then there is the cigar-shaped object. It's long, it's cylindrical, and it's less frequently reported but consistently associated with unusual behavior, including the appearance or disappearance of smaller craft nearby. If these were all the same type of object, why would they behave so differently? Why would one operate like a scout, another like a stationary observer, and another like something far larger and more complex? Unless they're not all the same, unless they're part of something larger, something coordinated and something structured. And this is where the conversation shifts from curiosity to something more serious, because if these objects are organized, then someone or something is organizing them. That implies intention. That suggests that these aren't random encounters or accidental sightings, but part of an ongoing activity. And once you consider that possibility, the entire framework changes. The question is no longer simply, what are people seeing? Instead, it becomes, what is happening? And maybe more importantly, why? So as we move forward tonight, we're going to take each of these shapes and examine them in detail. We'll look at real cases, real witnesses, and real moments when something entered our skies and behaved in ways that remain unexplained to this day. And as we do, I want you to keep one idea in mind for me, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. What if UFOs aren't random? What if they're organized? Because if they are, then everything we think we know about this phenomena may only be scratching the surface. And whatever lies beneath that surface, that may already be in motion. Now that we've established the possibility that UFO sightings may not be random, but instead part of a larger organized system, we need to take a closer look at each of the three primary shapes that I introduced earlier. And there's no better place to begin with that than the most iconic shape of them all, and that's the saucer. This disc-shaped craft is, well, without question, the image most people associate with UFOs. It's the shape that has identified the phenomena in popular culture for decades. It's on that "I want to believe" poster that everyone has hanging, in their bedrooms or in their office. But beyond the imagery and beyond the headlines and the Hollywood portrayals, especially in those 1950 sci-fi movies, there's something more important about these objects that often gets overlooked. It's not just how they look, it's how they behave. From the earliest reports to modern day encounters, saucer-shaped objects are consistently described as small to medium in size, highly maneuverable, and capable of movements that seem to defy our current understanding of physics. They accelerate instantly, they change direction without slowing down, they hover without any visible means of propulsion, and maybe most notably, they do all of this in near silence. These aren't the characteristics of something that's just drifting or lost. These aren't the characteristics of something controlled, something responsive, something intentional. To understand this behavior, we need to return once again to that foundational moment in 1947, that sighting by Kenneth Arnold. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Arnold observed 9 objects flying in formation near Mount Rainier. And what makes this account so compelling isn't just the description, but it's also his credibility. Arnold was an experienced pilot. He was familiar with aircraft behavior, speed, and distance, and he wasn't prone to making up things or exaggerating things, and he had nothing to gain at all from making this claim that he made. Now, in his own words, he described the objects as moving erratically, weaving in and out of formation, and traveling at speeds estimated to be well over 1,000 miles an hour. At the time, no known aircraft could achieve anything close to that. Even more intriguing was the way the objects seemed to maintain control at those speeds, never colliding, never breaking formation. They were moving in a chaotic way, still in that formation, and they moved with what appeared to be precise coordination. So it wasn't random motion. This was a controlled flight. And that distinction here is critical, because if something's controlled, it implies guidance, it implies decision making, and it implies purpose. So now let's fast forward just a few years to 1952. And now we find ourselves over the skies of Washington, D.C., where one of the most well-documented UFO incidents in history unfolded. Over the course of multiple nights, radar operators at Washington National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base detected unidentified objects moving through restricted airspace. These weren't fleeting blips or isolated anomalies. These objects were tracked repeatedly, appearing and disappearing, changing direction abruptly, and in some cases, pacing or evading military aircraft sent to intercept them. Air traffic controller Harry Barnes, who was on duty at the time, later stated that the objects' movements were unlike anything he had ever seen. They didn't follow conventional flight paths. They didn't behave like traditional aircraft. They didn't even behave like weather phenomena. Instead, they exhibited what he described as completely radical movement patterns. And at one point, fighter jets were scrambled to investigate. And as they approached these objects, the radar contacts would completely vanish. When the jets withdrew, the objects would reappear. Now, this pattern repeated itself multiple times and suggests not only awareness, but responsiveness. It's difficult to overstate how significant that is, because now we're no longer dealing with something that simply moves in unusual ways. We're dealing with something that appears to react, something that seems to observe its surroundings, something that may even be aware of being observed in return. And this is where the concept of reconnaissance begins to enter the conversation. When you look at the behavior of saucer-shaped UFOs across multiple cases, a pattern begins to emerge. These objects are often seen in areas of interest, near military installations, near nuclear facilities, near populated regions, and they appear suddenly, they move rapidly, then they disappear just as quickly as they came. They don't linger for extended periods like the triangular craft we'll discuss later. Instead, they seem to pass through, gather information, and then move on. And that behavior is strikingly similar to what we would expect from a reconnaissance system. Something designed to observe, to monitor, to collect data, to assess, and then to leave. There are numerous cases that support this very idea. Pilots, both civilian and military, have reported encounters with disc-shaped objects that seem to check them out before accelerating away at incredible speeds. In some instances, these objects have been observed pacing aircraft, matching speed and altitude with precision, like they were examining them. And then without warning, they disappear. They leave, often in a way that defies explanation, disappearing into the distance or shooting upward at extreme velocity. And one of the most compelling aspects of these encounters is the consistency with which they're reported. Decade after decade, witnesses describe the same general shape, the same type of movement, and the same interaction patterns. This isn't a phenomena that evolves dramatically over time. It remains remarkably stable. And that stability suggests design. If these were experimental aircraft, we would expect to see changes, improvements, variations, stuff like that. If they were natural phenomena, we would expect inconsistency and unpredictability. But what we see instead is repetition. We see the same form, the same function, over and over again. Now, it's important to acknowledge here that there are alternative explanations that have been proposed over the years. Some have suggested that these sightings could be advanced military technology, developed in secret and tested in controlled environments. Other people say that they could be misidentified natural phenomena or even psychological projections influenced by cultural expectations. Now, while those explanations could possibly account for some of the sightings, they struggle to explain the full scope of the data, particularly when you factor in trained observers, radar confirmation, and just the sheer number of consistent reports across time. So we're left with a question. If these objects aren't random, if they're not easily explained, if they're not evolving in the way we would expect from human technology, then what are they doing? What's their purpose? When you look at their behavior, fast, agile, responsive, and often fleeting, it becomes interestingly difficult to ignore the possibility that these objects are performing a specific role, a role that aligns closely with reconnaissance. They appear, they observe, they interact, sometimes briefly, and then they leave, almost like they've come to do a task and they've completed that task and now they're gone. And if that's the case, if these saucer-shaped objects are acting as scouts, then the implications become a lot larger because scouts don't operate in isolation. Scouts report back. They're part of a system that gathers information, processes it, and then acts on it. And that brings us back to the central idea of this episode. If UFOs are organized, then each type may serve a different function within that organization. The saucer may be the most visible of that puzzle, the one we've seen the longest and the one we recognize most easily. But it may also be just one part of something that's a lot more complex, something that's layered, something coordinated, something that doesn't just pass through our skies, but operates within them. And if that's true, then that's what we've been witnessing for decades. And it may not be a random encounter at all. It may just be glimpses of an ongoing operation. And with that, it is unfortunately time to take another break. So take a listen to this, and I'll be right back, and we'll talk about the Black Triangle.
You've listened to the stories. You've questioned the truth. Now it's time to wear it. Head over to ParaReality.com and check out the official ParaReality merchandise shop. T-shirts featuring the official podcast logo, the iconic ParaReality all-seeing eye, plus mugs, hats, totes, pillows, stickers, and yes, even something for your pooch. But while you're there, don't stop at the merch. Look a little closer. Dig a little deeper. Somewhere on the site, you'll find the entrance to the secret bunker, the members-only section of ParaReality.com. Inside, the ParaReality top secret files. Real FBI documents on UFOs, aliens, Bigfoot, Adolf Hitler, and more. Plus classified audio, some of the strangest messages ever left on the secret bunker hotline, and access to a secret podcast side project that's never been released publicly. And here's the best part. It's all absolutely free. Once you're in, don't forget to claim your free ParaReality Podcast Secret Bunker t-shirt. Just make sure you place your order. The truth is out there. The bunker is waiting. Visit ParaReality.com and find what you weren't supposed to.
Welcome back, everybody. Let's continue with talking about the Black Triangle. Is it a control and presence deal? So if the saucer represents speed, agility, and reconnaissance, then the Black Triangle, in my opinion, represents something entirely different. It's not fast in the way that the saucers are described. It doesn't dart across the sky or vanish in an instant, at least not at first. Instead, it does something far more unsettling. It lingers, it hovers, and it makes its presence known. And in doing this, it changes the nature of the encounter entirely. Because when witnesses describe Black Triangle UFOs, they're not talking about brief glimpses or distant lights. They're describing massive structured craft, often enormous in scale, moving slowly and silently at low altitudes. Now, these objects are frequently reported as being large enough to block out sections of the night sky, sometimes obscuring stars as they pass overhead. And that detail comes up again and again, that sense that something physical, something solid is above them. And not a light, not a reflection, not something easily dismissed, but there's something there. And perhaps even more striking than their size is their silence. Witnesses consistently emphasize that these objects produce little to no sound, even when they are described as being just a few hundred feet above the ground. And there's no engine noise, no rotor wash, no sonic disturbance that would match something of that scale, nothing, just silence. And that alone presents a problem, because anything we know of, any aircraft capable of lifting something that large produces noise. It produces force. It produces a presence that can be heard as much as it is seen. But these objects seem to operate outside of those expectations. Now, one of the most well-known cases involving a Black Triangle occurred in 1997 over Arizona, and a case that's come to be known as the Phoenix Lights Incident. On the night of March 13th, 1997, thousands of people reported seeing a massive V-shaped formation of lights moving slowly across the sky. Some described it as a formation, while other people insisted it was a single solid object with lights positioned at its corners. Now, what makes this case particularly compelling isn't just the number of witnesses, but it's the consistency of their descriptions. People from different locations who were at different areas, who had no contact with each other, reported seeing the same general shape. That's the same slow movement and the same silent passage across the sky. Among those witnesses was then Governor Fife Symington, who initially just dismissed the event completely. As a matter of fact, he made a big joke out of it. But later, he came forward and admitted that he had actually seen that object himself. And he described it as enormous, and he said that it appeared to be a structured craft that he couldn't identify. Now, that's an important detail. This wasn't a casual observer or someone unfamiliar with aviation. Fife Symington was a trained pilot, and he was also a sitting governor. Let's not forget that. He was someone who understood what conventional aircraft looked like and how it behaves. And yet he couldn't explain what it was that he saw. Now, skeptics have pointed to military flares as a possible explanation for at least part of the Phoenix Lights events. And while it is true that flares were dropped later that night during a training exercise, many witnesses maintain that what they saw earlier in the evening was something entirely different. It was something structured, and it moved as a single object, and it did not behave like flares would that are drifting in the wind. And this is where we begin to see a pattern that mirrors what we observed with the saucers, but with a different set of behaviors. The triangle doesn't appear to be scouting. It appears to be more present. It remains and occupies space. And that distinction matters, because when something occupies space deliberately, especially at a low altitude over populated areas, it suggests a different kind of function. Not observation from a distance, but control within proximity. And another major case that reinforces this idea was the Belgian UFO wave from 1989 to 1990. Now, over the course of several months, hundreds of sightings were reported across Belgium, and many of them described large triangular craft with the lights at each corner and a central illumination. What sets this case apart is the involvement of the Belgian Air Force. You see, radar stations tracked unknown objects performing maneuvers that defied explanation. And then fighter jets were scrambled to intercept these objects, and pilots reported difficulty maintaining a lock due to the object's rapid acceleration and unpredictable movement. At one point, radar data indicated that one of these objects dropped from an altitude of approximately 10,000 feet to just 500 feet in a matter of seconds. And that's something that would subject any known aircraft to forces far beyond structural limits. And no telling what it would do to the person that was inside of it either, right? Now, General Wilfried de Brouwer of the Belgian Air Force later addressed these events, and he acknowledged that the objects displayed capabilities that couldn't be explained by conventional technology. And again, we're faced with a situation where trained observers, backed by instrumentation, encounter something that behaves in a way that doesn't align with anything we currently understand. But beyond speed and maneuverability, which these objects do occasionally demonstrate, the defining characteristics of the triangle remains its presence. It stays around, it hovers, it moves slowly, like deliberately, like it's not in a hurry. And that raises an entirely different set of questions, because if the saucer appears to gather information quickly and then leave, the triangle seems to do the opposite. It takes its time. It remains visible. And in some cases, it's observed for extended periods, and this allows multiple witnesses to see it clearly. Why? If this were something attempting to avoid detection, it wouldn't behave this way. It wouldn't hover over populated areas, and it wouldn't move slowly across the sky in plain sight in full view of everybody. unless avoidance isn't the goal, unless the goal is something different, something else entirely. When you begin to consider the possibility that these objects are part of an organized system, the triangle starts to look less like a mystery and more like a function. It's like a platform, something designed to operate within specific environments for a specific purpose. Its size suggests capacity, room for things like systems and equipment, something we don't fully understand yet. Its silence suggests advanced propulsion, and that's something that's fundamentally different from conventional aircraft. And its behavior suggests intent, not to pass through, but to remain, to monitor and observe over a period of time, just to maintain a presence. And in military terms, this would be closer to a surveillance platform or an area control asset, something that establishes itself within a region and gathers information continuously rather than in just little brief spurts, passes. And if that interpretation holds even partially, then the implications become really difficult to ignore here, because now we're not talking about brief encounters or isolated sightings. We're talking now about something that can position itself over an area, over a region, and stay there. Something that can observe not just for a minute, but an extended period of time. Something that may be watching us, not just passing by. And when you place that alongside the behavior of saucer-shaped objects, a pattern begins to take shape. The saucers move more quickly, covering ground, interacting briefly, and then leaving. The triangles move slowly, establishing a presence, maintaining a position, and observing over time. Different behaviors, different roles, potentially part of the same system. And that brings us back to the central question. If these objects are organized, then what are they organizing around? What's the objective? What's being observed? And maybe most importantly, who or what is behind all this? Because if something has the capability to operate in our airspace with this level of control, this level of consistency, and this level of apparent intent, then we aren't dealing with random anomalies. We're dealing with something structured, something purposeful, something that may have been here for longer than we've been paying attention. And if the triangles represent presence, if they represent control within a given space, then the next question becomes inevitable. What supports the presence? What coordinates it? What exists above it or behind it that makes it possible? Because systems don't operate without structure, and structure implies that there's something larger, something we haven't fully seen yet, but maybe something we've already glimpsed. And I have a personal experience with this, and that's the cigar-shaped object, or the mothership theory. So if the saucer suggests reconnaissance and the triangle suggests presence, then the cigar-shaped UFO introduces a possibility that this is much harder to ignore. It suggests scale, not just in size, but in function. Because unlike the first two, cigar-shaped objects aren't reported as frequently. They are more rare, they're less commonly seen, and often described in ways that feel almost out of place, like something that doesn't need to appear often to serve its purpose. But when they are seen, the descriptions are strikingly consistent. Witnesses describe long cylindrical craft, sometimes metallic, sometimes glowing, moving slowly across the sky or hovering at a high altitude. In some cases, they're described as being enormous, far larger than any conventional aircraft. In others, they appear distant but unmistakably structured, with defined edges and sometimes even rows of lights along their length. And then there's the detail that makes these sightings stand apart. That's the association with smaller objects. So across multiple reports that span decades and really kind of, I guess, even centuries, witnesses they've claimed that smaller craft, often disc-shaped ones, appear in proximity to these larger elongated objects. And in some accounts, they seem to emerge right out of these cigar-shaped objects. In others, they maneuver around them before departing at high speed. Now, it's important to approach that detail carefully. Not every report includes it, and not every account can be verified, but the pattern's there, and it's been there for a long time. So to understand just how far back this thing goes, we need to step away from modern UFO history and look at something that predates powered flight altogether, and that's the airship wave from 1896 to 1897. And during that period, newspapers across the United States carried reports of mysterious objects in the sky, and witnesses described them as elongated, cigar-shaped craft, often equipped with lights and sometimes even structures resembling gondolas or cabins. And these objects were seen moving against the wind, hovering, and in some instances descending low enough for witnesses to claim they saw occupants. Now, at first glance, these reports might seem easy to dismiss as misidentifications or just outright hoaxes. After all, this was a time of rapid technological imagination when the idea of airships captured the public's attention. But there are details within these accounts that don't align neatly with that explanation. For one, many of the reported movements exceeded what would have been possible with the technology of the time. These objects were described as moving swiftly, changing direction, and in some cases accelerating in ways that would have been difficult to achieve even with modern propulsion systems. More importantly, the shape itself, the elongated cylindrical form, matches what we continue to hear in modern reports. That continuity is difficult to ignore because it suggests that whatever people were seeing in the late 19th century may not have been entirely disconnected from what people are seeing and reporting today. So now you fast forward to more modern times, and we begin to see similar descriptions emerging again, often in the context of high altitude sightings. Pilots have occasionally reported seeing long cylindrical objects at extreme altitudes, sometimes stationary, sometimes moving slowly, and sometimes disappearing in ways that defy explanation. While these cases are less well known than incidents like the Washington sightings or the Phoenix lights, they carry a different kind of weight. Many of these witnesses are trained observers, individuals accustomed to identifying aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, and anomalies. And when they report something that doesn't fit, in my mind, that raises a lot of questions. But maybe the most compelling modern connection to this category comes from an event that at first glance seems to fall outside of it entirely. And I'm talking about the 2004 encounter involving the USS Nimitz carrier strike group. In that case, Navy pilots, including Commander David Fravor, encountered what's become to be known as the Tic Tac object. It was described as a smooth, white, elongated craft with no visible wings, no propulsion system, and no means of lift that could be identified. It moved in ways that defied conventional physics, accelerating rapidly, it stopped instantly, and even descending from high altitude to near sea level in a matter of seconds. Now, the Tic Tac itself isn't cigar-shaped in the traditional sense. It's smaller, it's more compact, but its shape, elongated and cylindrical, featureless, shares characteristics with the larger objects described in other reports. And more importantly, the context of that encounter suggests something else. Before the pilots visually engaged the object, radar operators had been tracking anomalous contacts descending from high altitudes, sometimes as high as 80,000 feet, down to lower altitudes in just a matter of seconds. And these objects would then linger in the area and then just disappear again. That pattern Objects appearing from above, interacting within a region, and then departing echoes the behavior described in other cases involving larger, less frequently seen craft. It raises the possibility that what the pilots encountered wasn't an isolated object, but part of this larger system that we've been talking about tonight, a system that may include different types of craft operating at different levels. And this is where the mothership theory begins to take shape. That idea itself isn't a new one. It's been proposed in various forms over the years, often in speculative context. But when you strip away the more sensational elements and you focus on the data, the shapes, the behaviors, the patterns, it becomes less about speculation and more about interpretation. You see, if you have smaller, agile craft that appear, maneuver, and depart, and you've got larger, slower craft that establish presence and remain within the area, then the existence of an even larger structure, something that supports, deploys, or coordinates those activities, becomes a logical explanation. Not a certainty, but a possibility. Because systems by their nature are layered. They operate across different scales. They include components that serve different roles, from the smallest and most agile to the largest and most stable. And when you look at the cigar-shaped UFO through that lens, it begins to resemble something less like a standalone craft and more like a platform, something that doesn't need to move quickly because its role isn't to chase or observe in short bursts. Its role may be to remain at a higher level, physically or functionally, and support the activity below. And that could take a lot of different forms. It could be a staging point. It could be a command structure. It could be a deployment system or something else entirely that we don't yet have the framework to fully understand. But whatever it is, its rarity may be part of its function. Because if something operates at a higher level within a system, it doesn't need to be seen as often. It doesn't need to enter the lower environment unless it's kind of necessary. So it can remain distant and out of reach and go largely unnoticed. And yet every so often it appears, just enough to remind us that it may be there. And here's where my personal experience comes in, because I, my friends, have seen a cigar-shaped UAP. It was probably around 2013 or so. So it's been a minute. I walked out onto my front porch and I looked up in the sky as I was walking out, and there in front of me was a long white cylindrical object with no wings, no visible form of propulsion, and no windows, no lights. And it was moving slowly across the sky from probably south to north, I would say. And no noise whatsoever. Now, I do not think that it was one of these motherships as I've been talking about, because it did not appear to me to be that big. It wasn't really high up in the air. It was only probably, I would say, 1,500 to maybe 2,000 feet, if that. It might have been even a little bit lower than 1,500 feet. Now, I have experience from when I was working for the Department of Defense in the Army, being around rotary wing aircraft. So I definitely know it wasn't a rotary wing. And I live not too far from the Nashville International Airport. And I know you're going to say, well, goddamn, it could have been an airplane from the airport. I thought of that, but it wasn't, because the flight patterns, the flight paths that the planes use when going over my home go from east to west and west to east. They do not go north to south or south to north. There are no patterns like that for commercial aircraft. And I know it wasn't a commercial aircraft because, like I said, it was silent. There were no windows, there were no lights, and there were no wings, no visible means of propulsion. I know it wasn't a private prop job plane. Once again, same reasons. So I don't know what it was, but it was a long white cylindrical object that was moving slowly across the sky with no visible means of propulsion and no wings. So whatever it was, I don't know, but I'm saying it was unidentified because I couldn't identify it. Now, it's important to be clear about what we can and cannot say with these things, because we don't have definitive proof that these cigar-shaped UFOs are motherships. At least not in the traditional sense. We don't have confirmed evidence that they deploy smaller craft or coordinate activity, but we do have patterns. Now, what I saw did not have any craft circling it or going into it or coming out of it. It was by itself. Doesn't fit the classic description, this classic sighting of a cigar-shaped craft, yet it's my experience. Now, we do have repeated descriptions of these elongated objects across time. We have accounts, some more credible than others, linking these objects to smaller craft. And we have a broader context in which multiple types of unidentified objects appear to operate with distinct behaviors. And taken by themselves, each of these elements, well, they can be questioned. But if you put them together, then they begin to form a picture. But not a complete one, but at least a framework, right? And within that framework, the cigar-shaped object occupies a unique position. It's not the most commonly seen. It's not the most easily recognized, but it may be the most significant because if it represents the upper layer of a system, if it's part of something larger that supports or coordinates the activity of other craft, then it changes the scale of the conversation completely. We're not looking at individual encounters anymore. We're looking at infrastructure. And that brings us back once again to the central question of this episode. If UFOs are organized, then what does that organization look like? Because now we have three layers. The fast-moving, agile objects that appear to observe and interact. The large, silent craft that establish a presence and maintain position. And the rare, elongated objects that may operate above it all. Different forms, different behaviors, different roles. And possibly one system. And if that system exists, then the next step is completely unavoidable, in my opinion. So we have to connect the pieces. We have to look at how these elements fit together, because once you start to see the pattern, it becomes very difficult to unsee it. And now is a perfect time to take that dramatic break, and we'll come back and see if we can connect these systems. So wait right here, listen to this, and I'll be back really soon. Hey guys, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have a story, a question, or a topic you'd like me to cover? If so, you can reach me directly by email at sandman@parareality.com. Or for a more personal touch, you can just call the Secret Bunker at 615-461-5001 and leave a message. Just know that by calling, you're giving me permission to feature your voice on the podcast. Again, that number to call is 615-461-5001. You want to stay up to date with all things ParaReality? Then follow me on all major social media platforms. You can find me on Facebook at sandman.parareality, or you can follow me on X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok by looking for my handle at ParaReal Radio. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel by looking for ParaReality 1. That's ParaReality with the number 1 behind it. And don't forget to visit my website, ParaReality.com. That's where you'll find an archive of all of my past podcast episodes for free. You can also find the latest in paranormal news from all around the world under the Para News section. Your support means everything, whether you buy something from my store or leave me a positive review on whatever podcast app you're listening on. A 3-star or higher review goes a long way in helping this podcast reach new listeners, and I would truly appreciate it. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. All right, let's see if we can connect this system. By this point, we've examined 3 different types of unidentified aerial phenomena: the saucer, the triangle, and the cigar. Each one presents its own set of characteristics, its own behaviors, and its own unanswered questions. But standing alone, each can still be debated, dismissed, or explained away, depending on perspective. It's when you place them side by side that something begins to shift, because the differences between them aren't just random. They're functional. The saucer is fast, agile, and responsive. It appears suddenly, maneuvers with precision, and then departs just as quickly. It behaves like something that's gathering information in short bursts. It interacts briefly with us and its environment, and then it moves on. Then you have the triangle, and the triangle by contrast is massive, slow-moving, and silent. It doesn't dart or evade in the same way. Instead, it lingers. It hovers, and it establishes a presence within a specific area, often remaining visible long enough for multiple witnesses to observe it clearly. And then there's the cigar-shaped object. It's larger than the triangle, but still less frequently observed. And it's often positioned at higher altitudes or in more distant contexts. It doesn't appear to engage in rapid maneuvers or extended low altitude presence. Instead, it occupies a different role, one that may exist above or beyond the immediate environment in which the other two operate. And when you examine these 3 types together, a pattern begins to emerge, not in just how they look, but in what they do. And that pattern suggests specialization. It suggests that these objects aren't interchangeable. They're not performing the same tasks in different forms. They're performing different tasks in different forms. And that's the hallmark of a system. Any organized system, whether biological, mechanical, or technological, it has different components. And those components are designed to fulfill specific roles. You don't build a system where every part does the same thing. You build a system where each part contributes to a larger objective. Some components gather information, some maintain presence, and some coordinate or support activity at a higher level. And when you apply that framework to what we've been talking about tonight, the parallels are really difficult to ignore. The saucer aligns with reconnaissance. It moves quickly, it observes, it interacts, and it departs. The triangle aligns with surveillance or control. It remains within a space, a region. It monitors over time and establishes a sustained presence. And then the cigar aligns with support or coordination. It exists at a higher level. It's less frequently seen, but potentially connected to the activity of the other two. Now, it's important to approach this very carefully, because I'm not claiming certainty here. I'm not saying this is gospel, okay? I'm not saying that this is definitively how these objects function. But what I am doing is I'm recognizing a pattern and exploring what that pattern could mean. Because when patterns repeat, especially across independent sources, they deserve attention. And the pattern here, well, it's not a subtle one as far as I'm concerned. It's consistent, it's persistent, and it raises a question that is both simple and kind of profound. What if these objects aren't acting independently? What if they're part of a coordinated system operating within our airspace? That question alone changes the entire conversation, because if these things are connected, if they are components of a larger structure, then we're no longer dealing with isolated events or unexplained anomalies. We're dealing with activity, ongoing activity that's been observed for decades and probably longer than that. And that leads us to another critical point, and that's consistency over time. One of the most striking aspects of UFO reports isn't just how similar they are across the world, but how similar they are across time itself. Witnesses in the 1940s described objects that behaved in ways that mirror reports from the 1990s, the early 2000s, and even to today. The shapes remain consistent. The behaviors remain consistent. The interactions remain consistent. That level of stability is unusual. If this were human tech, we'd expect to see evolution. We'd expect to see changes in design, improvements in performance, variations in structure, and stuff like that. But what we see instead is continuity, almost as if the system has already reached a level of development that doesn't require visible change. Or maybe, I don't know, what if we're seeing is not experimental stuff at all, but operational, right? And that distinction is significant, because experimental systems are tested and refined and they're modified. Operational systems are deployed. They are used. They perform functions reliably and consistently over time. And if these objects are part of an operational system, then their consistency makes a lot of sense. Their roles are defined, their behaviors are repeatable, and their presence is not accidental. It's purposeful. And that brings us, dear listeners, to the implications. Because if something is operating in our airspace with this level of organization, this level of consistency, and this level of apparent intent, then several possibilities emerge. First, it suggests awareness. These objects aren't just moving randomly. They appear in specific locations, often in proximity to areas of interest, and they interact with aircraft. They respond, at least in some cases, to attempts at interception or observation. And that implies a level of awareness of their surroundings. And second, it suggests capability. The performance characteristics described in these encounters, instant acceleration, silent hovering, extreme maneuverability, stuff like that, that indicates technology that operates beyond what at least is publicly known or understood. Whether that technology is human, non-human, or something else entirely, that's a separate question. But the capability itself is evident in what we're seeing and in the reports. And third, and perhaps most importantly, this suggests intent. If these objects are part of a system, then that system has a purpose. It's doing something. It's operating with a goal in mind, even if that goal isn't clear to us. And this is where the conversation becomes a little more complex, because once you accept the possibility of intent, you have to consider what that intent might be. Is it observation? Is it monitoring? Is it data collection? Or is it something else, something more, something different entirely? Well, we don't have the definitive answers to those questions, but we do have patterns that suggest that activity isn't random. And that brings us to a turning point. For years, the UFO phenomenon has been framed as a mystery, something that needs to be solved, explained, or debunked. But what if that framing is incomplete? What if the phenomena isn't just a mystery, but a process? What if it's something ongoing, something structured, something that operates whether we understand it or not? And if that's the case, then the sightings we've been discussing aren't isolated glimpses into the unknown. There are moments where all that process becomes visible to us. And when you start to look at it in that way, the question shifts once again. It's no longer just, what are these objects? It becomes, what are they doing? And perhaps even more importantly, it becomes, how long have they been doing it? Because if this system exists, if these objects are components of something organized, then it didn't appear overnight. And it didn't begin suddenly out of the blue in 1947. It didn't start with radar or modern aviation. It may have been here long before we had the ability to detect it clearly or see it clearly, long before we had the language to describe it, long before we started paying attention. And that possibility carries a lot of weight because it suggests that whatever's happening may not be new. It just may simply be newly observed. And as we move into the final segment of this episode, that's where we need to focus, not just on the patterns we've identified, but on what those patterns might mean. Because once you see the system, you have to ask yourself, what role, if any, do we play within it? And as we bring this episode to a close, we need to take a step back and look at everything we've talked about tonight, not as isolated pieces, but as a whole. We began with a simple question, and that was, what if UFOs aren't random? And from there, we examined three distinct types of objects that's been reported consistently for decades: the saucer, the triangle, and the cigar. Each one presents its own characteristics, its own behaviors, and its own unanswered questions. But when we view these things together, they begin to form something more than a collection of sightings. They begin to form a pattern. And patterns, especially persistent ones, tend to point toward structure. The saucer moves quickly, appearing and disappearing with precision, interacting briefly with its environment. The triangle lingers, hovering in silence, maintaining a presence over a specific area. And the cigar-shaped object, though it's rare and distant, it suggests something operating on a different scale, something that may exist above or beyond the immediate activity of the other two. 3 forms, 3 behaviors, 3 possible roles. And when you align those roles, reconnaissance, presence, and support, you begin to see an outline of a system, not a random assortment of objects, but a layered operation with distinct functions. And that's where the implications begin, because if what we're witnessing is in fact a system, if these objects are coordinated in any meaningful way, then we're no longer dealing with a mystery that can be solved by identifying a single object or explaining a single sighting. We're dealing with something that's ongoing. We're dealing with something that's structured, something that operates with consistency over time. And that raises questions that aren't easily answered. The first is awareness. If these objects are part of a system, then that system is aware of its environment. It operates within our airspace, often in proximity to areas of interest like military installations, population centers, and other strategic locations. It interacts, at least in some cases, with aircraft and responds to attempt at interception. That suggests a level of awareness that goes beyond random movement. The second is capability. The performance characteristics described in these encounters: instant acceleration, silent hovering, extreme maneuverability. That indicates technology that operates beyond what at least is publicly known. Whether that tech originates from human development, non-human intelligence, or something else entirely remains an open question. But the capabilities themselves are evident in the data. And the third, and maybe the most significant, is intent. If there's a system, then there is purpose. Systems aren't arbitrary. They are designed, or at the very least, they function in ways that achieve specific outcomes. So the question becomes, what is the purpose? Is it observation, monitoring, data collection, something more complex, something more sinister? Oh, we don't have any definitive answers, but we do have patterns that suggest the activity is deliberate. And once you consider that possibility, the conversation changes, because now we're not simply asking whether unidentified objects exist. We're asking whether those objects are part of something that is actively operating around us. Something that may have been operating around us for a very long time. And that leads to a more difficult question, one that sits just beneath the surface of everything we've talked about tonight. And that's this: if this system exists, what's our place within it? Are we being observed? Are we being studied? Are we just simply being monitored over time? Or are we simply incidental? One element within a much larger environment that's being examined for reasons that we don't yet understand. That's a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer, because it forces us to shift our perspective. For most of human history, we viewed ourselves as the observers, right? We study our environment. We analyze what we don't understand. We send out probes, satellites, and other instruments to gather the data about the world and beyond. But what happens when that perspective is reversed? What happens when we are the ones being observed? Not in a dramatic or invasive sense, but in a quiet, consistent, methodical way. The way we observe wildlife, the way we monitor ecosystems, the way we study patterns over time. If that's even partially true, then the sightings that we've been talking about tonight aren't random encounters. They're moments where that observation becomes visible. Brief interactions between our awareness and something that's usually just beyond it. And those moments, while rare, are enough to leave an impression. They're enough to raise questions, enough to suggest that there may be more happening than we fully understand. Now, it's important to remain grounded with all of this. We do not have definitive proof of a coordinated system. We do not have confirmation of origin, intent, or structure. But what we do have are patterns, observations, and data points that, when viewed together, suggest a possibility. That's a possibility that deserves consideration, because just dismissing it outright doesn't make it go away. And accepting it blindly doesn't make it true. The value lies in the exploration, in asking the questions, in examining the patterns, and in remaining open to where the evidence may lead. And that, dear listener, brings us back to where we started. What if UFOs aren't random? What if the shapes we've been seeing, the saucers, the triangles, the cigars, aren't isolated anomalies, but components of something larger, something organized, something structured, something that operates with purpose, even if that purpose isn't clear to us yet? If that's the case, then the phenomena isn't just a mystery waiting to be solved. It's a system waiting to be understood. And understanding it may require us to rethink not only what we see in the sky, but how we see ourselves within it. Because the moment you begin to consider that these objects may be connected, that they may be part of something coordinated, the entire framework shifts. The question is no longer simply, are we alone? It becomes something far more complex. Like, who is operating within our skies? What are they doing? And how long have they been doing it? Those aren't easy questions. And they're not questions with immediate answers. But they are questions worth asking. Because every time someone looks up and sees something they can't explain, something that moves in a way that defies explanation, something that appears and disappears without warning, that moment becomes part of a larger pattern. A pattern that, piece by piece, may be revealing something that we're only beginning to recognize. And maybe that's where we need to leave it tonight. Not with certainty, not with conclusions, but with a possibility that what we're witnessing isn't random, that it may be organized, and that whatever lies behind it may already be here. Thank you for joining me tonight. Stay curious, stay grounded, and as always, keep your eyes on the sky. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's episode of ParaReality. The next episode will drop on April 10th, 2026 at 8 o'clock p.m. Central U.S. time with another episode of the Midnight Syndicate. So make sure you tune in, and find out. I hope that this podcast opens up your mind to new ways of thinking, expands your consciousness, and produces a change in the way you see the world. If you wish to change, you must lift the veil of ignorance that has been cast over your eyes. Only then will you see the true power of the universe. Thank you for sticking around with me for this extra long episode of ParaReality. I hope that you got something out of it and it made you think. And I hope that you have a wonderful evening, a great weekend, and I will see you again next week. Good night, everybody.
If you wish to change, you must first lift the veil of ignorance that has been cast over your eyes. Only then will you see the true power of the universe.